A policeman crosses all boundaries by brutally assaulting a little black girl right in front of her mother, but no one expected Dwayne Johnson to step in and fight back hard. What happens next becomes a turning point that changes everything. Subscribe, share this video and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the bustling neighborhood park. Laughter rang out as children raced from one end of the playground to the other, their joyful cries blending with the rhythmic creak of swings and the soft rustling of leaves. 7-year-old Ava was in the heart of it all, her braids bouncing as she giggled and ran across the wood chip covered ground. She stopped only to climb the monkey bars, her small hands gripping tightly as she called out to her mother. Seated on a nearby bench, Laura watched her daughter with a soft smile, her hands loosely clutching the paperback novel that now lay forgotten in her lap. She was a woman who carried the weight of life gracefully, her warm brown eyes reflecting years of quiet resilience. She scanned the playground, taking in the carefree energy of children lost in their world of games, the gentle hum of parents chatting nearby. It was a rare moment of peace when she cherished deeply the surrender. Kay was shattered when a figure appeared at the edge of the park. A white police officer dressed in the crisp uniform surveyed the scene with a rigid expression. His presence was not entirely unusual. Officers occasionally patrolled the area, but something about the way he moved, deliberate and searching, sent a shiver through Laura. His gaze swept across the playground, pausing briefly on each child until it landed on Ava. Laura's smile faded as the officer began walking toward her daughter, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, seemed unnaturally loud against the backdrop of children's laughter. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She stood up, her book sliding from her lap to the ground. Forgotten Ava, oblivious to the approaching figure, was now perched at top the slide, waving enthusiastically to Laura. The officer stopped at the base of the slide, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the small girl. Laura quickened her pace, her voice catching in her throat as she called out, "Ava!" The officer's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." His tone was sharp, devoid of the warmth one might expect in a place filled with children. He reached up and grabbed Ava's arm, his grip firm and unyielding. Aa's laughter turned to a startled cry. She wriggled against his hold, her small voice trembling as she called for her mother. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, her confusion and fear palpable. Laura reached them within seconds, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you doing? Let her go." Her voice was steady despite the panic rising within her. The officer didn't release his grip. Instead, he turned to Laura, his gaze cold. "Ma'am, step back. This is a official business." Laura's hands balled into fists at her side. "She's my daughter. You have no right to touch her like this." She stepped closer, her voice growing louder, drawn the attention of nearby parents and children. The playground's lively atmosphere had begun to shift, the once joyful noise now tinged with confusion and concern. The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I need you to step back now." Laura refused to move. She reached for Aa's free arm, but the officer's other hand pushed her away with surprising force. She stumbled but caught herself, her eyes blazing with anger and fear. Ava's cries grew louder, her small body trembling under the weight of the confrontation. The tension in the air was suffocating, each passing second feeling like an Eternity other parents began to approach. Cautiously their phones raised recording. The scene unfolding before them Laura. Her voice cracking pleaded please just let her go. She's just a child the officer's grip on. Ava remained unrelenting his actions a stark contrast to the warmth and safety. The playground once promised tears streamed down Laura's face as she stood her ground her love for her daughter overpowering her fear. And then in the midst of chaos something shifted in the atmosphere. A tall figure watching from a distance began moving purposefully toward the scene. The approaching presence was steady, unhurried, yet filled with unmistakable determination. Eyes turned toward him, sensing that the tide of this encounter was about to change. The tension in the air was almost tangible as the tall figure drew closer. His strides purposeful, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding in the playground. Dwayne Johnson, unmistaken in his presence, had been enjoying a quiet stroll with his daughters when Ava's frightened cries cut through the ambient noise. His sharp instincts kicked in, and the sight of a uniformed officer gripping a small terrified child made his blood run cold. He knew he couldn't stand idly by. Children and parents who had been frozen in place now turned their attention to Dwayne. Whispers rippling through the crowd, his towering figure commanding yet calm exuded an aura of control. Dwayne's daughters, sensing the urgency, stayed behind with a family friend as he strode toward the scene. Hey, his voice was firm, cutting through the chaos like a gavel. The officer didn't turn immediately, but A's cries faltered as she caught sight of the man approaching. Let her go, Dwayne said, his tone deep and unyielding. The officer finally turned, his face a mask of irritation and disbelief. Sir, stay back, this doesn't concern you. Dwayne stepped closer, closing the distance with a steady resolve. You've got a terrified little girl in your grip. It concerns all of us. Ava, still trembling, reached out toward her mother, who stood frozen between fear and relief at the sight of this unexpected ally. Laura's voice shook as she tried to speak, but Dwayne held up a hand signaling her to stay calm. The officer squared his shoulders, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged so openly. This is a law enforcement matter, he said, his voice growing louder as if volume would solidify his authority. Step back. Dwayne didn't flinch. A law enforcement matter. She's a child and you're terrifying her. His words were measured, but the SCE in his voice was unmistakable. You're the one who needs to step back. The officer's jaw tightened. He glanced at the growing crowd there, phones raised, capturing every moment. The weight of the scrutiny seemed to aggravate him further. He released Ava's arm abruptly, but his hand remained clenched, his posture tense. Ava stumbled toward her mother, who pulled her into a protective embrace. Understood. Here's the continuation. That's enough, Dwayne said, taking another step forward, his massive frame now directly between the officer and the child. You don't lay hands on kids ever. The officer, visibly bristling, jabbed a finger at Dwayne. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Dwayne leaned in slightly, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. What I'm getting into is making sure that kid feels safe again. The officer, visibly flustered, took a step back, but his frustration boiled over. You think you can just walk up here and play hero? This is my job. Dwayne's eyes narrowed. Your job is to protect, not intimidate. His tone was calm, yet it carried a weight that silenced the murmurs in the crowd. Right now you're the one who's aligned. The officer looked around, seeing the sea of eyes and cameras trained on him, his bravado faltered, and for a moment he seemed unsure of what to do next, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat completely. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he muttered, his words directed more at the crowd than at Dwayne. Dwayne, unfazed, glanced down at Ava, who clung to her mother, her sobs subsiding but her body still shaking. He looked back at the officer, his expression hardening. "If your job involves hurting kids, then yeah, I will tell you how to do it." Back off. The tension between them hung in the air, electric and unyielding. The officer took one last look at Dwayne, as if weighing his options before retreating a few steps. The crowd seemed murmured, emboldened by Dwayne's intervention. Some clapped, others shouted words of encouragement. Dwayne turned to Laura and Ava, his expression softening. He crouched slightly to meet Ava's wide tear streak eyes. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Ava nodded hesitantly, her tiny fingers clutching her mother's sleeve. Laura managed a faint smile, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Dwayne gave a reassuring nod, but didn't let his guard down. The officer was still nearby, simmering with anger, his hand hovering near his radio. Dwayne straightened his gaze, locking with the officer's once more, silently daring him to escalate the situation further. The officer finally muttered something into his radio and turned away, retreating toward the park's edge. Dwayne watched him go, his body still tense, ready for anything. Only when the officer disappeared from sight did he finally exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. The crowd began to disperse, some offering words of gratitude as they passed Dwayne. He gave them polite nods, but stayed focused on Laura and Ava. "You two okay to get home?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. Laura nodded, her voice firmer. "Now we'll be fine, thanks to you." Dwayne glanced at the lingering onlookers, his jaw tightening. "I don't think this is over yet," he said, his voice low. "Stay safe, and if anything else happens," he pulled out his phone quickly, exchanging numbers with Laura. "Call me." Laura hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We will." Dwayne gave Ava one last reassuring smile before stepping back. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. As Dwayne walked back toward his own family, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The sun that had once bathed the park in warm golden light seemed dimmer now, shrouded by the heavy tension that refused to dissipate. Dwayne remained in the park, his eyes scanned in the playground, ensuring the officer was truly gone. But as he turned to leave, a sharp, commanding voice stopped him in his tracks. "You think you can just walk away?" The officer had returned, his face flushed with anger and frustration. His movements were erratic, his hand still dangerously close to the holster at his side. Dwayne turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He locked eyes with the officer, his stance firm but calm. "I thought you'd had enough," he said, his voice steady. "You really want to do this here with all these people watching?" The officer took a step closer, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd that had begun to gather again. His gaze darted around briefly, but his pride pushed him forward. "You don't get to play the hero and walk away like nothing happened. You don't know the full story." Dwayne tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I know enough. You grabbed a kid, scared her, hurt her. That's the only story that matters." The officer's lips curled into a snarl. "She was acting suspicious. I was doing my job." "Suspicious?" Dwayne's voice rose slightly, his disbelief evident. "She's 7 years old. She was playing on a slide What exactly looks suspicious to you? The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find a response. The silence spoke volumes, and the crowd began to murmur louder. Dwayne took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His presence is unyielding as a mountain. You see a kid having fun and you decide she doesn't belong. That's not doing your job, that's abuse of power. And you know what? The officer's face turned red, his anger bubbling to the surface. He reached out, suddenly grabbing Dwayne's shoulder in an attempt to push him back. The movement was quick, aggressive, but Dwayne was faster. His hand shot up, gripping the officer's wrist with strength that stopped him cold. Don't, Dwayne said firmly, his voice dropping to a low rumble. The officer tried to yank his hand free, but Dwayne didn't let go immediately. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his eyes piercing. You've already crossed too many lines. Don't make it worse. The officer finally pulled back, his steps unsteady. As he regained his balance, his fury was palpable, but so was the doubt creeping into his expression. The crowd had grown larger. Now their phones raced, documenting every second. The officer's gaze flickered nervously toward them, the realization of his actions sinking in. You think you're untouchable because people know your name, he spat, his words laced with bitterness. You're not above the law. Dwayne crossed his arms, his demeanor calm but resolute. Neither are you, and right now everyone here sees who's breaking it. The officer clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. He looked around, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on him. The confrontation had turned into a spectacle, one he could no longer control. The anger in his face began to waver, replaced by something closer to fear. Dwayne took a step back, giving the officer space to retreat. Walk away, he said, his voice soft but commanding. It's over. For a moment it seemed the officer would refuse, that his pride would force him to escalate further, but then the sound of distant sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. His face twisted into a grimace as he turned sharply, striding toward the edge of the park without another word. The crowd erupted into murmurs as the tension broke, people exchanging glances and comments about what they had just witnessed. Dwayne stayed rooted in place, watching until the officer disappeared from sight. Only then did he exhale, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Nearby, Laura and Ava remained close, the little girl clutching her mother's hand tightly. Laura approached cautiously, her eyes filled with gratitude and lingering fear. Thank you, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the chatter of the crowd. Dwayne turned to her, his expression softening. You don't have to thank me, I'm just glad she's safe. Laura nodded, pulling Ava closer. The girl buried her face in her mother's side, her small frame trembling. She's still scared, Laura said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to make her feel safe again. Dwayne crouched to Ava's level, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. Hey, kiddo, he said, his tone warm and reassuring. You're the bravest person here. You know that what happened wasn't right, but you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Ava peeked up at him, her eyes wide and watery. Promise, she whispered. Dwayne smiled, his expression earnest. Promise. The sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of additional police. Dwayne straightened, his expression hardening once more. This isn't over, he said quietly to Laura, but you're not alone in this. Laura nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. Thank you, she repeated, her voice stronger this time. As the first police car pulled up, Dwayne stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, but he was prepared to see it through, for Ava, for Laura, and for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The sirens wailed louder as two police cruisers pulled up to the edge of the park. Officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion and caution as they took in the scene. The crowd had thinned slightly, but those who remained held their phones high, recording every moment. Dwayne stood near the playground, his massive frame unshaken, while Laura clutched Ava protectively at her side. The officer who had instigated the conflict paced near the edge of the park, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He approached the arriving officers, gesturing wildly as he tried to explain his version of events. Dwayne kept his eyes on him, his instincts sharp, ready for any sudden moves. The first officer from the new group, a woman with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, approached Dwayne. Her badge glinted in the fading sunlight as she stopped a few feet away. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" Dwayne nodded, his voice steady. "That officer," he said, nodding toward the man now animatedly explaining himself to another officer, "grabbed a child without cause. He scared her, hurt her, and wouldn't let her go. I stepped in to stop him." The female officer's expression didn't change, but she took a quick glance toward Laura and Ava, who were standing nearby. "Ma'am," she said gently, addressing Laura, "is this true?" Laura stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Yes. My daughter was just playing on the slide. He came over, said she didn't belong here, and grabbed her. She was terrified. He wouldn't let her go, even when I tried to intervene." The officer's jaw tightened slightly as she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but serious. "Please stay here while we sort this out." She turned to the other officers, motioning for them to join her. Dwayne remained where he was, his arms crossed as he watched the group gather near the officer who had caused the scene. Their voices were low but tense, and the instigating officer was growing increasingly agitated. "I was doing my job," he snapped, his voice carrying over to where Dwayne and Laura stood. "That man has no right to interfere." The female officer raised a hand, silencing him. "We'll handle this, Officer Price. Please step aside for a moment." But Price wasn't done. He pointed directly at Dwayne, his face contorted with anger. "He assaulted me. He pushed me back and threatened me." Dwayne's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held the officer's gaze, his silence a deliberate statement. The female officer turned back to Dwayne. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone even. "I stopped him from hurting a child," Dwayne said simply. "If he felt threatened by that, maybe he should think about why." The crowd, still lingering, murmured their agreement. Several voices chimed in, "He's lying. That guy didn't do anything wrong. We saw everything." The officer was way out of line. The female officer raised her hand again, signaling for silence. She turned to Price, her expression firm. "We're going to take this one step at a time. You'll have your chance to explain." Price opened his mouth to argue, but one of the other officers stepped in, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let it go," the man muttered, his voice barely audible. Price stiffened but said nothing. The female officer addressed the crowd next. "If you have videos or photos of what happened, we encourage you to share them with us. You can approach my colleagues here or send them directly to the department." People began moving hesitantly toward the officers, their phones out, offering evidence. Dwayne glanced at Laura, who was now kneeling beside Ava, stroking her hair softly. His expression softened for a moment before he turned back to the female officer. "What happens now?" he asked. She sighed, clearly weighing her words carefully. "We'll review the footage and take statements. This incident will be investigated thoroughly. For now, we need everyone to remain calm." Price, still seething, muttered something under his breath, but the female officer shot him a sharp look, silencing him once more. She turned back to Dwayne. "Thank you for stepping in. We'll ensure this is handled appropriately." Dwayne nodded but didn't leave his position. "I'll stay until I know they're safe," he said, gesturing toward Laura and Ava. The officer gave a small nod of understanding. "Fair enough." As the situation began to de-escalate, the crowd slowly dispersed, though a few lingered at a distance, curious to see how it would all end. Laura approached Dwayne, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you again," she said softly. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been here." Dwayne offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to thank me. This isn't over yet, but you're not alone in this." Laura nodded, her grip on Ava tightening protectively. The female officer approached them again, her tone softer now. "We're going to escort you home," she said to Laura, "just to make sure you're safe." Laura hesitated, glancing at Dwayne. He gave her an encouraging nod. "Go with them. It's the right call." As Laura and Ava were guided toward a waiting police car, Dwayne stayed behind, watching them go. The weight of the day settled heavily on his shoulders, but he stood tall, knowing he had done the right thing. Still, a sense of unease lingered. This wasn't over. Not yet. The video of the confrontation at the park spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips appeared on every major social media platform, shared with captions ranging from outrage to admiration. "Actor Dwayne Johnson confronts police over mistreatment of a child," one headline blared. "Another read, hero or troublemaker?" Viral video sparks heated debate. By the next morning, Laura's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages flooded in, some from friends and family offering support, others from strangers sharing words of encouragement or demanding to know her side of the story. But mixed with the kindness were the darker undercurrents of online vitriol. Comments criticized her for letting the situation escalate or accused her of seeking attention. Overwhelmed by the sudden scrutiny, Laura turned off her phone. Meanwhile, Ava was quieter than usual. She stayed close to Laura, hesitant to play outside or even speak to her friends. Her bright energy had dimmed, replaced by a nervous watchfulness that broke Laura's heart. Every time the doorbell rang or a car slowed near their home, Ava flinched, her little hands gripping her mother's arm. Dwayne wasn't spared from the spotlight either. His agent called to warn him about potential backlash, but Dwayne brushed off the concerns. This wasn't about his career, he had seen something wrong and acted. It was as simple as that. Yet, the pressure mounted as media outlets began dissecting his actions. Was he a hero standing up against injustice, or had he overstepped his bounds? Despite the noise, Dwayne stayed focused. He reached out to Laura, offering her an Ava reassurance. "This attention will die down eventually," he told her over the phone. "But in the meantime, we need to make sure you two are okay." Laura appreciated his support, though she couldn't help but worry. "Ava's not herself," she admitted. "She's scared all the time now. I don't know how to help her feel safe again." Dwayne paused, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. "Let me visit," he offered. "Maybe I can talk to her, let her know she's not alone in this." Laura hesitated but eventually agreed. When Dwayne arrived later that afternoon, he found Ava curled up on the couch clutching a stuffed animal. She looked up at him with wide, cautious eyes, her grip tightening on the toy. Dwayne crouched down to her level, his voice soft and gentle. "Hey, Ava," he said with a warm smile. "Do you remember me?" She nodded slowly, her eyes darting to her mother for reassurance. Laura gave her a small, encouraging nod. "You know," Dwayne continued, "when I saw what was happening, I knew I had to step in because what that man did wasn't right. But you were so brave, Ava. Braver than a lot of adults I know." Ava's eyes widened slightly at his words, and a faint flicker of pride crossed her face. "I was?" she asked quietly. Dwayne nodded. "You were. And you know what? You're not alone in this. There are so many people out there who think you're amazing and want to make sure you're okay." Ava glanced at her mother, then back at Dwayne. "Really?" "Really," he said firmly. "And if you ever feel scared, I want you to remember that there are people like me and your mom who are always here to protect you." Ava's small shoulders relaxed slightly, and she managed a timid smile. Laura watched the exchange with tears in her eyes, grateful for Dwayne's kindness and patience. As the days passed, the video continued to spark conversations. Advocacy groups picked up the story, using it as a rallying cry against systemic injustice. Protests were organized, calling for accountability and reforms. Dwayne found himself thrust into a larger movement, one he hadn't planned to lead but couldn't walk away from. Meanwhile, Ava began to heal. With Dwayne's support, Laura worked to rebuild her daughter's confidence. They attended community events together, where Ava met other children who shared similar stories. Slowly, her bright spirit began to return. But not everything was resolved. The officer who had started the confrontation, now identified as Officer Price, remained defiant. He went on record defending his actions, claiming he had acted within his authority. His statements only fueled the public's anger, and calls for his dismissal grew louder. Dwayne knew the fight wasn't over. He met with Laura and Ava again, this time with a plan. "We need to keep the momentum going," he told Laura. "This is bigger than what happened at the park. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Laura agreed, though the prospect of staying in the public eye made her nervous. "I just want Ava to feel safe," she admitted. "She will," Dwayne assured her. "And so will a lot of other kids because of what you're doing." The story had taken on a life of its own, drawing attention not just to the park incident but to the broader issues it represented. Dwayne, Laura, and even little Ava became symbols of resilience and the fight for justice, their lives forever changed by a single fateful day. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Laura, holding Ava's hand tightly, took her seat. Beside them sat Dwayne, his presence steady and reassuring, as it had been since that day in the park. The room was filled with a mixture of reporters, community leaders, and supporters who had followed the case with unwavering attention. The investigation into Officer Price's actions had been thorough and swift. The video evidence, coupled with witness statements, painted a damning picture. Price's repeated claims of just doing his job crumbled under the scrutiny of his actions, and today marked the culmination of weeks of public outrage and legal proceedings. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. As the session began, the prosecutor laid out the case, detailing how Price's actions violated not only protocol but also the basic rights of a child. Dwayne listened intently, his jaw tightening as each point drove home the gravity of what Ava had endured. When the defense spoke, Price's lawyer tried to frame his actions as misjudged but well-intentioned. He believed there was a legitimate concern, the attorney argued. It was a misunderstanding, not malice. But the prosecution countered with precision, replaying the video for the courtroom to see. Gasps rippled through the audience as the footage showed Price grabbing Ava, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence, her cries echoing painfully in the silent room. When it was Dwayne's turn to testify, he approached the stand with quiet confidence. His words were deliberate and powerful, recounting what he had witnessed and why he had stepped in. "No child should ever feel unsafe in a place meant for joy," he said, his voice steady. "What I saw that day wasn't about protecting anyone, it was about power, and it was wrong." Laura testified next, her voice trembling but resolute. She spoke of Ava's fear, the way it had lingered long after the incident, and her determination to ensure no other family would endure the same pain. Ava, too young to take the stand, watched quietly, her small hand never leaving her mother's. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Officer Price was found guilty of misconduct and dismissed from his position. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and muted applause from the crowd. While it wouldn't erase what had happened, it was a step toward accountability, a moment of justice in a world that often felt unjust. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as questions flew. Laura shielded Ava from the chaos, but Dwayne stood firm, addressing the crowd with the same measured strength he had shown from the beginning. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident," he said. "It's about creating a world where every child feels safe, where no one is judged by the color of their skin or where they come from. This is a victory, but the fight doesn't end here." The words resonated, spreading quickly across news outlets and social media. Dwayne's unwavering stance made him a symbol of courage and justice. But for him, it wasn't about the spotlight, it was about Ava, Laura, and every person who had ever felt powerless. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for Laura and Ava. The outpouring of support from their community was overwhelming. Local organizations rallied to provide resources, counseling, and safe spaces for families who had experienced similar struggles. Ava, slowly but surely, began to reclaim her childhood. She laughed more, played outside again, and even started to share her story with other children, finding strength in her voice. Dwayne stayed connected, visiting often and ensuring Laura and Ava had everything they needed. On one visit, he brought Ava a small engraved bracelet that read, "You are brave." She wore it every day, a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. One afternoon, as they sat in Laura's living room, Ava climbed onto Dwayne's lap, her face thoughtful. "You said I'm brave," she said softly, "but I was scared." Dwayne smiled, his large hand gently patting her back. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he said. "It means you face your fear and keep going, and that's exactly what you did." Ava smiled, her small arms wrapping around his neck in a hug. Laura watched the exchange, her heart full of gratitude. In the midst of chaos, they had found something unshakable: hope. Months later, the ripples of that day in the park were still felt. The local police department implemented new training programs focused on community relations and de-escalation tactics. Advocacy groups gained momentum, pushing for broader reforms. And while Dwayne returned to his life and career, he carried the lessons of that day with him, determined to use his platform to amplify the voices of those who couldn't always speak for themselves. For Laura and Ava, life moved forward. There were challenges, but they faced them with the knowledge that they were not alone. They had found strength in each other and in the support of those who stood by them. As Ava ran across the playground one sunny afternoon, her laughter ringing out once more, Laura knew they had won something more precious than justice: they had reclaimed their joy. The months following the courtroom victory brought both challenges and opportunities for Laura and Ava. The legal battle had ended, but its effects lingered in the corners of their daily lives. Ava still hesitated sometimes when entering a new space, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting a shadow to loom. Laura worked hard to rebuild her daughter's sense of safety while navigating her own journey of healing. Their small home, once a haven of quiet routine, now buzzed with the energy of change. Supporters rallied around them, offering more than just words. There were scholarships for Ava's education, community programs for families, and even a mural painted at the park where the incident occurred. The mural depicted children of all backgrounds playing together under a banner that read, "This space is for everyone." Laura returned to her job as a teacher, finding renewed purpose in her work. She brought her experience into her classroom, encouraging her students to speak up for themselves and others. Her voice carried a weight it hadn't before, one tempered by resilience and clarity. Over time, she found herself stepping into a leadership role in her community, joining advocacy groups and speaking at local events about the importance of justice and inclusion. Ava, too, began to thrive in ways Laura hadn't anticipated. At first, the little girl was hesitant to talk about what happened, but over time, she found confidence in sharing her story. Her classmates listened intently as she described the day she was afraid and how people had stood up for her. It wasn't long before Ava became known as a quiet but powerful advocate among her peers. One afternoon, Ava came home with a flyer in her backpack. It was for a youth leadership program focused on teaching children about standing up for what's right. "Can I do this, Mom?" she asked, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Laura smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course you can," she said. "I think you'd be amazing." Meanwhile, Dwayne stayed involved in their lives, though his presence was less frequent as his professional obligations resumed. He continued to check in, sending occasional messages or dropping by unannounced to spend time with Ava. On one visit, he brought her a notebook. Its cover was simple, but inside the pages were filled with inspirational quotes and blank spaces for Ava to write her thoughts. "This is for your big ideas," he told her, watching as she flipped through the pages. "You've got a lot to say, and the world needs to hear it." Ava grinned, hugging the notebook to her chest. "I'm going to write everything," she said with determination. As the seasons changed, so did their lives. The park became a regular spot for Laura and Ava again, a place of laughter and connection rather than fear. Ava often ran to the swings, her face glowing with the freedom of childhood restored. Laura, watching her daughter, felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for Dwayne's intervention that day, but for the countless strangers who had stood behind them in solidarity. And then, one autumn evening, an unexpected knock came at their door. Laura opened it to find a familiar face: Officer Price. He stood awkwardly on the porch, his posture stiff but his face sincere. Laura's breath caught, her instincts screaming to protect Ava, who was playing in the next room. But something in Price's demeanor gave her pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly, as if sensing her hesitation. I wanted to apologize." Laura stared at him, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She'd imagined him fading into the background after the trial, never to cross their path again. Yet here he was, looking genuinely remorseful. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he continued, his voice subdued. "About what I did. I was wrong. There's no excuse for how I treated Ava or you." Laura crossed her arms, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here?" Price shifted uncomfortably. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "I've started working with a community outreach program. They've helped me see things differently, things I was blind to before. I know an apology won't undo the harm I caused, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Laura studied him for a long moment. His words seemed genuine, but trust wasn't easily rebuilt. Still, she nodded, her voice measured. "Ava's been through enough," she said. "If you're serious about change, prove it by making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Price nodded, his face a mixture of relief and regret. "I will," he said. "Thank you for even listening." Laura watched him leave, her emotions swirling. When she closed the door, Ava appeared at her side, her small hand slipping into Laura's. "Who was that?" she asked. "No one you need to worry about," Laura said, kneeling to face her daughter. "Just someone trying to make things right." Ava nodded, her trust in her mother unshaken. She held up her notebook. "I wrote a poem today," she said proudly. Laura smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "You're going to change the world one day, Ava," she said softly. "I can already see it." As the evening settled into a quiet calm, Laura realized that while the scars of their experience might never fully fade, they had found something far more lasting, a sense of purpose, strength, and hope. Their story was no longer just about what had been taken from them. It was about what they had gained and what they would build together. As the weeks turned into months, Laura and Ava's lives continued to evolve. The weight of the past began to lessen, though its lessons remained ever present. Ava's confidence grew steadily, nurtured by the unwavering support of her mother and the community that rallied around them. Laura had become a respected voice in local advocacy circles, speaking at town halls and schools about the importance of accountability and the power of standing together. Her ability to connect with people was unmatched, her words carrying the weight of personal experience and heartfelt conviction. One evening, Laura stood before a packed auditorium, her voice clear and steady as she recounted the events that had forever altered her family's life. "We were just a mother and daughter enjoying an afternoon at the park," she said. "But what happened that day showed us both the worst and the best in people. It reminded me that change is possible when we don't back down from doing what's right." The audience erupted into applause, many standing to show their support. Among the crowd sat Ava, proudly watching her mother. Beside her was Dwayne, who had come to the event unannounced. He nodded at Laura as their eyes met, his silent gesture one of respect and encouragement. After the event, Dwayne approached Ava, who was busily signing small thank you notes to people who had supported their cause. "Your mom was amazing up there," Dwayne said, crouching to her level. Ava grinned. "She's always amazing." Dwayne smiled, ruffling her hair. "Just like you." Their bond had grown over the months, with Dwayne becoming a steady presence in Ava's life. He often brought books, games, or just words of encouragement, making sure she always felt supported. One weekend, Dwayne invited Laura and Ava to a community event he was hosting. It was a celebration of diversity and resilience, complete with food trucks, live music, and activities for kids. When they arrived, Ava was greeted like a celebrity. People who had seen her story approached to share their admiration and gratitude. Ava handled the attention with surprising poise, though she occasionally glanced at Laura for reassurance. Laura, in turn, watched her daughter navigate this new world with pride and a tinge of protective instinct. During the event, Ava took to the stage, holding Dwayne's hand for support as she addressed the crowd. Her voice was small but firm as she said, "Thank you for believing in me. And for believing that kids like me deserve to feel safe. I'll never forget what you've all done for me and my mom." The crowd's applause was thunderous, and Ava beamed with pride. Dwayne leaned down and whispered, "You're a natural, kiddo." As the event wound down, Dwayne pulled Laura aside. "You know," he said, "Ava's got something special. She's going to do big things one day." Laura smiled. "I think so too." Despite the strides they had made, challenges still lingered. Ava occasionally had nightmares about the incident, waking up in tears and seeking the comfort of her mother's embrace. Laura remained patient, comforting her and reminding her that she was safe. One night, after tucking Ava into bed, Laura sat alone in the living room, reflecting on how much their lives had changed. She thought about the mural at the park, the flyers for community programs, and the messages of support they still received. Each reminder of that day carried pain, but it also carried proof of how far they'd come. Meanwhile, Officer Price had quietly begun his own journey of redemption. After his apology, he had taken steps to make amends, volunteering with local organizations and participating in outreach programs. His presence at community events was initially met with skepticism, but over time, people began to acknowledge his efforts to change. One day, Price approached Laura at a community meeting. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice careful and measured. "I just wanted to let you know I've been working to do better, not just for myself but for the people I hurt. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know." Laura regarded him for a long moment before nodding. "Change takes time," she said simply. "But it's a start." Ava, too, encountered Price at one such event. She glanced at him, then at her mother, before offering a small wave. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a step toward healing for both sides. As Ava grew, so did her sense of purpose. She excelled in the youth leadership program, often bringing her notebook filled with ideas and plans for projects she wanted to start. One of her first initiatives was a school-wide kindness campaign, where students wrote anonymous notes of encouragement to each other. The campaign's success made Ava a school-wide figure of inspiration. Her peers began looking up to her, and teachers praised her for her empathy and leadership. One evening, Laura found Ava sitting at the kitchen table, her notebook open and her face focused. "What are you working on, sweetie?" Laura asked, sitting beside her. Ava looked up with a determined smile. "I want to start a club," she said. "For kids who feel scared or left out. A place where they know they belong." Laura's heart swelled with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, Ava. I'm so proud of you." As the seasons changed again, the park became a place of celebration and renewal. Families of all backgrounds gathered there, their laughter filling the air. The mural remained a powerful reminder of the community's resilience and the strength of unity. Laura and Ava often visited, sometimes sitting on a bench near the swings, watching as children played freely. One sunny afternoon, as Ava swung higher and higher, her laughter ringing out, Laura felt a deep sense of peace. They had come a long way from the fear and pain of that day, and while the memory would always remain, it no longer defined them. Dwayne joined them occasionally, his presence a constant source of encouragement. On one visit, he stood with Laura, watching Ava play. "She's incredible," Dwayne said, his voice filled with admiration. "She is," Laura agreed, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "You both are," he added, his tone serious. "What you've done, it's not just about that one day. You've given people hope." Laura smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and pride. "We all did this together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Ava ran toward them, her face glowing with joy. "Can we stay a little longer, Mom?" she asked. Laura nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." And as they stayed in the golden light of the evening, Laura realized they had found not just safety but a new kind of freedom, a life filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. Months passed, and the echoes of that fateful day at the park gradually softened into lessons that shaped the lives of everyone involved. For Laura and Ava, those lessons became the foundation of a renewed purpose, a mission to make the world better for those who could not always defend themselves. Ava's school club flourished, transforming into a support network that reached beyond her school. With Laura's help, Ava expanded the club into a local initiative called Safe Space Kids. The program offered workshops, storytelling sessions, and group activities for children who had experienced bullying, fear, or isolation. Ava often shared her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had learned to stand tall with the help of others. One memorable day, Ava stood on a stage at a community event, speaking to a crowd of families, teachers, and local leaders. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, now carried strength and conviction. "I was scared once," she began, clutching the bracelet Dwayne had given her. "But I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you don't let the fear stop you. And now, I want to help other kids feel brave too." The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Laura, tears of pride streaming down her face, and Dwayne, his expression a mixture of admiration and satisfaction. As Safe Space Kids gained momentum, it drew attention from larger organizations. Donations poured in, allowing Laura to leave her teaching job and work full-time on managing the program. Ava, despite her young age, became a figurehead for the initiative, appearing in local news segments and community panels alongside her mother. One day, while sitting together in their living room, Laura showed Ava an email from a national advocacy group that wanted to partner with them. Ava's eyes widened as she read the message. "Mom, does this mean we can help more kids?" she asked excitedly. "It does," Laura replied, pulling her into a hug. "You're making such a difference, sweetheart." The collaboration allowed Safe Space Kids to reach schools across the state, offering resources and training to teachers and parents. Ava's notebook, once filled with small, hopeful ideas, became a blueprint for change. Dwayne remained a steadfast supporter, attending events and encouraging Ava every step of the way. He often reminded her that her voice mattered and that she was capable of extraordinary things. "You've got the heart of a warrior," he told her during one of his visits. "And warriors don't just fight, they inspire." In the meantime, Officer Price's transformation continued. His work with outreach programs led him to speak openly about his mistakes and the biases that had shaped his actions. He became an unexpected ally in advocating for police reform, sharing his journey as an example of accountability and growth. At one event organized by Safe Space Kids, Price asked Laura for permission to address the audience. "I know my presence here might feel strange," he began, his voice steady but humble. "But I'm here because I want to be part of the solution. I failed to see the humanity in a little girl and her family. I've learned that true strength comes from admitting when you're wrong and working to make things right." The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Laura nodded at him from her seat, acknowledging his efforts. Ava, sitting beside her mother, whispered, "Do you think he's really trying to help now?" "I do," Laura said gently. "People can change if they choose to." As the years went by, the park where the incident had occurred became a symbol of transformation. The mural grew more vibrant with time, its colors refreshed by local artists. It became a gathering place for events, celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection. One summer evening, Laura and Ava returned to the park for a special commemoration. The city had decided to rename the playground in honor of the Safe Space Kids initiative. A new sign was unveiled, reading, "Bravery Park, a place for all." Ava was invited to speak, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. She stepped up to the microphone, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "When I was little, this place scared me," she said, her voice steady. "But now, it's a place where everyone can feel safe and loved. Thank you for helping us make that happen." The applause that followed was thunderous. Ava glanced at Laura, who smiled encouragingly, then at Dwayne, who gave her a proud thumbs up. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Laura and Ava sat together on a bench. "Do you ever think about that day?" Ava asked softly, leaning against her mother. "Sometimes," Laura admitted. "But not in the same way. Now, when I think about it, I see how far we've come and how strong we've become because of it." Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Me too. I think it made us braver." "It did," Laura said, wrapping an arm around her. "And it showed us what we're capable of when we don't give up." Dwayne joined them moments later, carrying a tray of ice cream cones. Thought you two could use a treat, he said, handing them each a cone. As they sat together, laughter and joy surrounding them, the weight of the past felt lighter. The scars it left were still there, but they had been transformed into something stronger, a story of resilience, hope, and the power of standing together. And as Ava looked out at the playground, now filled with children of every background playing freely, she felt something she hadn't known was possible that day in the park: peace.